Alright, so how do I improvise? In this series, we're going to talk about the ideal process for improvising, the conceptual stuff. My goal here is to go beyond what the other standard YouTube videos say about improvising. There are 1,000 videos that can teach you chord scale theory, chord tone soloing, licks, etc., but there's more to improvisation than that. That stuff is surface level, get me in the right ballpark content, and I want to go deeper than that. This is going to allow us to build a foundation and to think about improvising in a healthy way, which will make our lives much easier when we tackle the practical side of things. Let's do it. So in 1997, Andreas Lehmann and Anders Ericsson introduced what they term the triangular model of representation as a way that performers can realize music. Their model had 3 points: goal imaging, motor production, and self-monitoring. The first, goal imaging, refers to the process of imagining how something would sound when performed. The second, motor production, refers to the act of executing that imagined performance. Finally, self-monitoring refers to the evaluation of that production. Let's examine this process in more plain terms by pretending we're typing at a computer. Someone shows us a picture of a guitar and tells us to type that word. In this scenario, goal imaging would mean understanding that the object in the picture is called a guitar, perhaps the correct spelling, and the subsequent decision to type that word. Successful motor production would mean that we are familiar enough with the keyboard layout to reproduce the word. Self-monitoring would then hinge on our ability to evaluate the result. Did we spell it right? Did we write down piano instead? Etc. In the course of this series, we're going to focus on the first 2 points, goal imaging and motor production. This isn't to say that self-monitoring isn't necessary, because it is, but the purpose of this series is to explore the disconnect between the first two. Goal imaging and motor production make up the moment, whereas self-monitoring happens after the fact and judges or evaluates the moment. We're working on the moment itself in this case. In a nutshell, we're going to abandon 1 point of the original triangular model, leaving us with 2 points, a linear model, which I've broken down into 4 sections. Let's have a look. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to goal imaging as hearing and motor production as executing. While doing my research, I decided it made the most sense to stick something else in between the 2 points, translating. This is the phase in which we process the input and convert it into the necessary output form. I actually don't think of translation as an entirely separate phase, but as being half in each of the 2 big phases. Translation is the mental work of both hearing and executing. The other halves of hearing and executing exist in the physical realm. Hearing is essentially just data input. Translating is what makes sense of the input and readies it for output. Likewise, executing is the physical part of data output. If we were to draw this process as a horizontal flowchart, it would look like this. Often, beginner and intermediate improvisers struggle because they have shortcomings in one or more of these areas. Consider our typing example with the word guitar. If we know the word but don't know how to spell it, we can never type it. If we know the concept but don't know the word, we can never type it. If we know the word and how to spell it but don't know how to use a keyboard, we can never type it. The same applies to music. We often think of music as a language, but in the beginning, when we're still making sense of things, I think it's closer to 2, an input language and an output language. Suppose I'm learning a second language, but I'm not very good yet. If I have a thought in English and want to tell it to someone in Spanish, the input language would be easy, but the output language would be hard. Conversely, if someone says something to me in Spanish and I want to say it in English, the input language becomes difficult and the output language is easy. We must remember that our instruments are, quite simply, machines. We have to choose the correct input to elicit the correct output. So if we want middle C to sound from a piano, we must press the proper key. We have to speak both music language and machine language. Which one is more difficult will depend on the person, but the objective is to become fluent in both. When we become fluent in a language and start to think and speak in it more naturally, we drop the need for translating or converting anything. That's our goal. Improvising with freedom results from the mastery of identification and execution. It is the ability to hear something, identify it, know how to execute it on the instrument, and have the technical proficiency to deliver. If our skills are lacking in any part of the process, we fall short. Thus, our improvisers experience a disconnect which forces them to compensate in different ways. We'll look at some examples and solutions, but first let's define each phase of the process. As we can see in the chart, we can break things up into 2 physical elements and 2 mental elements. Let's go over each one so we really understand how the process works. Reception is the physical part of hearing. Unless someone is hearing impaired, this one's a given. Our bodies do this for us. This is data input without any processing. It would be like seeing a cat outside the window. It is the moment that we receive the input, but before we register what the input is. In improvising, however, part of the physical process is audiation. That is, hearing something in our heads that isn't actually being played. The visual equivalent would be imagining a cat and visualizing it in our minds without actually seeing one. If we were to sit in silence and think of the melody to Happy Birthday, that would be audiation. So while receiving a noise that is being extraneously produced is a given, hearing something that's only happening in our head is certainly not. It's a skill to be curated, and we'll explore exercises to do that. Identification is the mental part of hearing and one half of the translation process. This is the moment that we register what the input is. Let's go back to our cat example. Step 1 is purely receiving the input, just seeing the cat. But step 2 is the moment that we say to ourselves, that's a cat. In music, step 1 might be hearing an interval, and this step is identifying it as a minor third. As we become more proficient in the language, this happens on a much larger scale, and we start to process larger chunks of music at one time. Conversion is the mental part of executing and one half of the translation process. This is transformation of the identified material into the necessary output format. So we've heard a sound and identified it as a minor third. Now we must visualize how to execute that on our instrument. Likewise, we've seen a cat and identified it as a cat. Now we want to say it in Spanish. We think, okay, the word for cat is gato. If we wanted to say it in French, this part of the process would be different, as we think, okay, the word for cat is chat. But notice how the language we choose doesn't affect the first 2 phases of the process. The reception and identification of the input don't change. The only thing that changes is the output format. That's step 3. Execution is the physical part of, executing. This is the actual execution of the converted material, the moment of data output. This requires technical proficiency on the instrument and not just theoretical knowledge. So, we've seen a cat, thought, that's a cat, thought, the Spanish word for cat is gato, and now we have to actually say the word. This means that everything that makes up the vocal instrument is involved. Breath, vocal cords, vocal tract shape, the mouth, tongue, etc. Since we've been speaking our whole lives, we're most likely proficient in this area. Still, there might be some difficulties that come with speaking another language, such as accent, different vowel sounds, inflection, etc. Knowing this stuff on a theoretical level is one thing, but executing is another skill set. It's like knowing that a word has a rolled R, but not being able to do it. Step 3 is knowing, but step 4 is actually being able to do it. Most of us have to practice both. So, RICE. I'm not sure that acronym's useful for anything, but it's there. In the next video, we're going to talk about becoming proficient in each of these areas, and we'll look at some common problem areas and some solutions to get us on the right track. See you there.